I never thought anyone would read my journal. It wasn't meant for anyone else. The pages were mine, filled with the confessions I couldn't say out loud, the emotions I kept buried under polite smiles and carefully chosen words. But when I walked into the living room that afternoon and saw Nathan holding it, the blood drained from my face. "Where did you find that?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, startling him. Nathan looked up, his eyes wide with guilt. "It was on the coffee table," he said quickly, holding the journal up as though it were evidence of his innocence. "I didn't know it was yours." "Of course it's mine," I snapped, crossing the room in a few quick strides. I snatched it from his hands, my fingers trembling. He hesitated, his expression softening. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I only read a little." My stomach twisted at the thought of what he might have seen. "Nathan," I began, clutching the journal to my chest like it could shield me from the weight of his gaze. "You shouldn't have." But I stopped when I noticed the look on his face. It wasn't just guilt. There was something else there, something that made my cheeks flush. He wasn't looking at me like a son should look at a stepmother. He was looking at me like a man who had seen something he couldn't ignore. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said softly. "But the things you wrote." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What about them?" I demanded, though my voice was barely above a whisper. "They're honest," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "And sad. You wrote about feeling invisible, like no one really sees you. Is that true?" The question hit harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Of course it was true. That was the whole point of writing it down, so I wouldn't have to admit it to anyone else. "It's just thoughts," I said finally, turning away from him. "It doesn't mean anything." "It means something," he said firmly, his voice steady but gentle. I felt the tears rising, but I refused to let them fall. "Nathan, please just forget you saw it," I said, my back still to him. "It's personal." "Okay," he said after a long pause. "I'll drop it, but for what it's worth, you're not invisible. Not to me." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I clutched the journal tighter. When I finally turned to look at him, he was already walking toward the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming awareness that something had just shifted between us. After my husband passed 5 years ago, the house became too quiet. The silence was deafening at first, but over time, I grew used to it. I filled the days with little rituals to distract myself, tidying up rooms that didn't need cleaning, gardening until my hands ached, writing in my journal late into the night. When Nathan moved back in a few months ago, the quiet was replaced by the sound of his footsteps upstairs, the faint hum of his music drifting through the walls, the clatter of dishes as he helped himself to whatever leftovers I'd made. It was nice, having someone here again. But it was also unsettling. He wasn't the boy I had helped raise. At 24, he was taller, broader, with a confidence that hadn't been there before. His laugh was deeper, his gaze sharper, and the way he carried himself made it impossible to ignore the man he'd become. I told myself it was harmless, the way my heart fluttered when he smiled at me, or the way I lingered too long in the doorway when he was talking. I was just lonely, that was all. It didn't mean anything. But now, standing in the living room with my journal pressed against my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan had seen something in me that I didn't want anyone to see. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the moment in the living room over and over. I kept thinking about the way Nathan had looked at me, curious, almost tender. It wasn't the look of a boy who had made a mistake. It was the look of a man who had seen something raw, something real, and couldn't look away. I wanted to be angry at him for reading my journal, for crossing a line. But more than that, I was angry at myself for letting him see me like that. I had spent years building walls, keeping my emotions neatly contained. I didn't want anyone to know how lonely I was, how much I longed for connection, for someone to really see me. But Nathan had seen me. And the way he looked at me afterward, it made my heart race in a way I didn't want to think about. The next morning, I found Nathan in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a bowl of cereal in one hand and his phone in the other. The sunlight streaming through the window hit him just right, illuminating the auburn in his dark hair, the sharp line of his jaw. He looked relaxed, unaware of the way my chest tightened the moment I stepped into the room. I hesitated in the doorway, gripping the edge of the wall as I watched him. He hadn't noticed me yet, and I debated whether to just grab my coffee and retreat upstairs. But then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and there was that look again, steady, searching, impossible to avoid. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but the way his gaze lingered made it clear he hadn't forgotten yesterday. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal as I crossed to the coffee maker. My hands trembled as I reached for the mug, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me slightly. "I owe you an apology," Nathan said, setting his bowl on the counter. I froze, staring down into my coffee. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "I shouldn't have looked at your journal. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, genuine and unguarded, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a little. "I shouldn't have left it out," I said finally, glancing over at him. "It wasn't your fault. But thank you for saying that." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "For what it's worth, I only read a little. Just enough to know you've been carrying a lot." I stiffened, my chest tightening again. "Nathan?" "I'm not judging," he said quickly, stepping closer. I don't like the idea of you feeling like that. Like you're alone." I turned to face him fully, my coffee forgotten in my hand. "I'm fine," I said, the words automatic, practiced. "You don't have to be," he replied, his voice quieter now. "It's okay to let someone in." The vulnerability in his voice, the way his gaze held mine, it was too much. I looked away, gripping the mug tighter. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "You just don't want to believe it." The truth in his words made my chest ache. I swallowed hard, willing myself to keep it together. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Nathan, but I'm fine, really." He didn't argue, but the way he looked at me, like he could see straight through the walls I'd spent years building, left me feeling more exposed than ever. I turned back to the counter, busying myself with adding cream to my coffee, anything to break the tension. But even as I moved, I could feel his presence behind me, steady and unrelenting. "I just want you to know," he said quietly, "that I'm here. If you ever need to talk, or anything." His words lingered long after he left the kitchen, the quiet weight of them settling into the corners of the room. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, we found ourselves in the living room. Nathan had put on some music, something soft and instrumental, and the faint strains of the piano filled the space as we sat across from each other. I had picked up a book, more as a distraction than anything else, but I couldn't focus on the words. My gaze kept drifting to Nathan, the way he leaned back in the armchair, his long legs stretched out, one hand resting on the armrest. He looked so at ease, so unbothered by the tension I couldn't seem to shake. But then his eyes met mine, and I realized he wasn't as relaxed as he seemed. "You've been quiet," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Just tired," I lied, closing the book in my lap. Nathan studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to keep everything to yourself, you know." I let out a soft laugh, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Old habits die hard, I guess." "You've spent your whole life taking care of other people," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my breath hitch. "Nathan?" "I mean it," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You deserve that." I looked away, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "It's not that simple," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "It could be," he said softly. The quiet conviction in his voice made my chest tighten, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The music played on, filling the silence between us, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. I stood abruptly, clutching the book to my chest. "I think I'll head upstairs," I said, my voice unsteady. Nathan didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, he said, "For what it's worth, I see you, and I care about you." I froze, his words echoing in my mind as I gripped the edge of the doorway. I wanted to turn around, to say something, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. Instead, I nodded, the motion small and shaky, before retreating up the stairs. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, like I wasn't invisible. Like I wasn't just someone who existed in the background. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a deep shade of indigo, with faint streaks of gold clinging stubbornly to the horizon. I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for a simple dinner, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of chopping. The soft murmur of music drifted in from the living room. Nathan's playlist, I realized. His taste in music was so different from mine, but something about the faint hum of it made the house feel fuller. When I heard his footsteps approaching, my shoulders tensed instinctively. After the morning's conversation and his parting words last night, the air between us had felt too thick, too fragile. "Need a hand?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorway. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just come in from a quick shower. "I've got it," I said quickly, though my voice sounded thinner than I intended. Nathan stepped into the kitchen anyway, his movements unhurried. "At least let me set the table," he offered, reaching for the stack of plates without waiting for my reply. I wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but the sight of him moving around the kitchen so naturally, as though this were just another ordinary evening, stopped me. There was something comforting about it, even if I didn't want to admit it. "Do you remember the last time we cooked together?" he asked, his tone light but warm. I glanced at him, surprised. "Not really." "Christmas," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You let me help with the stuffing, and I burned the bread cubes." I laughed despite myself, the memory rushing back. "You didn't just burn them, you set off the smoke alarm." "Hey, I was 19, he said, grinning. "Cut me some slack." The ease in his tone, the way his smile reached his eyes, it was disarming. For a moment, I forgot the tension that had been building between us and let myself enjoy the warmth of his presence. By the time we sat down to eat, the house felt quieter, more intimate. The candles Nathan had insisted on lighting cast a soft glow over the table, their flickering light reflecting in his eyes as he poured wine into both our glasses. "To surviving another day," he said, raising his glass. I hesitated, then clinked mine lightly against his. "Cheers," I said softly. The meal passed in comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional comment or shared smile. I couldn't help but notice the way Nathan watched me. Not in the way one watches out of politeness, but with a quiet, unspoken curiosity that made my cheeks warm. After dinner, Nathan carried the dishes to the sink without being asked. I joined him, drying each plate he washed, the quiet rhythm of our movements oddly soothing. "You don't have to help, I said after a while. "Maybe I want to," he replied, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. His words were simple, but the way he said them, soft, deliberate, made something in my chest tighten. When we finished, I reached for the bottle of wine still sitting on the counter. "Want another glass?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Sure," he said, his smile easy. "Why not?" We moved to the living room, the remnants of dinner and the faint clink of glasses forgotten as we settled into the space. Nathan took the armchair, his long legs stretched out in front of him, while I curled up on the couch, tucking my feet beneath me. The music played softly in the background, a gentle, almost melancholic tune that filled the quiet without overwhelming it. I sipped my wine, the warmth of it spreading through me as I glanced over at Nathan. He looked relaxed, his head tilted back slightly, his fingers drumming idly against the armrest. "What's on your mind?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I hesitated, startled by the question. "What makes you think something's on my mind?" Nathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you're overthinking something," he said simply. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure, you don't," he said, his tone teasing but gentle. I took another sip of wine, letting the silence settle between us again. But I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unrelenting, and it made my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to name. "You've been different lately," he said after a moment, his tone quieter now. "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," he said, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. "Quieter, maybe more guarded." I let out a soft sigh, setting my glass down on the table. "It's just been a lot," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. "I get that," he said. "But you don't have to go through it alone." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was too much. I looked away, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "It's not that simple," I said softly. "Maybe it is," he said, leaning forward slightly. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. "Nathan?" "I mean it," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "You've spent so much time taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time you let someone take care of you." His words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt my breath hitch. I wanted to argue, to brush it off, but the truth of what he was saying was impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Because." I trailed off, unable to find the words. Nathan leaned back slightly, his expression soft but thoughtful. "Just think about it," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his words, the way he looked at me, it left me feeling unsteady, as though the ground beneath me had shifted. When I finally went to bed that night, his voice lingered in my mind, his words replaying over and over until I couldn't tell where they ended and my own thoughts began. The next afternoon, I found myself in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with a pair of pruning shears in one hand and a bundle of freshly clipped lavender in the other. The air was warm and thick, with the scent of earth and blooming flowers, a soft breeze offering just enough relief to keep the heat from being oppressive. The garden had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of tending to the plants. But today, even the familiar comfort of the soil beneath my hands couldn't quiet the thoughts swirling in my head. I didn't hear Nathan approach until he spoke. "Looks good out here." Startled, I glanced up to find him standing at the edge of the garden, one hand in his pocket and the other holding a bottle of water. He was dressed casually, in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair ruffled slightly by the breeze. "You scared me," I said, letting out a soft laugh as I sat back on my heels. "Didn't mean to," he said, stepping closer. "I just thought you might need a break." He held out the water bottle, his smile easy and warm. "Thanks," I murmured, taking it from him. He crouched down beside me, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "You've really got a knack for this," he said, nodding toward the neatly trimmed rows of flowers and herbs. "It's just practice," I said, unscrewing the cap of the bottle. "And a lot of trial and error." Nathan chuckled, the sound low and pleasant. "Still, it's impressive. I can barely keep a houseplant alive." I smiled faintly, taking a sip of water as I watched him. There was something about the way he was sitting there, relaxed and unguarded, that made my chest ache. He glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "Why wouldn't I be?" "You've been quiet," he said, his tone soft but probing. "More than usual." I sighed, setting the water bottle down beside me. "Just thinking," I said vaguely, hoping he'd leave it at that. But Nathan wasn't the type to let things go. "About what?" he asked, his gaze steady. I fiddled with the pruning shears in my hand, my chest tightening. "Life," I said finally. "Everything." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that." There was a pause, the silence between us filled with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I've been thinking a lot too," Nathan said quietly. I glanced at him, surprised by the shift in his tone. "About what?" "About what I'm doing with my life," he admitted, his gaze distant. "Where I'm going, who I want to be." His honesty caught me off guard, and I found myself setting the shears aside, giving him my full attention. "That's a lot to think about," I said softly. "Yeah," he said, a faint, self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I thought by this age I'd have it all figured out." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "No one has it all figured out, Nathan. Not even people twice your age." He looked at me then, his expression softening. "Do you?" The question hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "No," I said finally, my voice quieter. "I've been pretending for a long time, but no, I don't." Nathan leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his thighs as he studied me. "It's funny," he said after a moment. "I always thought you were the one who had it all together." I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening. "I've been faking it for years," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "After your dad passed, I didn't know what else to do. I just kept moving forward, because stopping wasn't an option." Nathan's brow furrowed, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was brief, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver up my spine. "You don't have to fake it with me," he said softly. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was too much. I looked away, my hands trembling as I reached for the lavender beside me. "It's hard to stop," I whispered, "when it's all you've ever known." Nathan didn't say anything right away, but when I looked at him, his expression was steady, unflinching. "You deserve to feel like yourself again," he said. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. "I don't know who that is anymore," I admitted, my voice trembling. His hand found mine again, this time lingering. "Then maybe it's time to find out." I stared at him, my chest tightening as his words hung in the air. The world around us seemed impossibly still, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind and the pounding of my own heart. For the first time in years, I felt like the walls I had built around myself were beginning to crack. The house was quiet by the time I came downstairs, the kind of deep stillness that only comes late at night. I had been tossing and turning for hours, my thoughts too tangled to let me sleep. The day's conversations with Nathan kept replaying in my mind, his words, his touch, the way he had looked at me in the garden. I told myself I just needed a cup of tea to settle my nerves. But the truth was, I was restless, pulled by an unease I couldn't shake. The dim light from the kitchen was soothing as I stepped inside, the cool tile grounding me. I moved automatically, filling the kettle with water, but the sound of footsteps behind me made me freeze. I turned to find Nathan standing in the doorway, his hair mussed and his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, as though he hadn't expected to see anyone awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I shook my head, reaching for a mug. "No, you?" "Same," he said, stepping into the room. There was a hesitation in his movements, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go, but he finally leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on me. I avoided his eyes, focusing on the task of preparing tea, but I could feel his presence, warm and steady, filling the room. For a while, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the kettle filled the silence, and I felt my pulse quicken, my hands trembling slightly as I busied myself with the tea bags. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. "Do you ever feel like you're not living your life? Like you're just going through the motions?" His question caught me off guard, and I turned fully to face him. The kettle momentarily forgotten. "All the time," I admitted, the honesty surprising even me. Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been feeling that way a lot lately," he said, "like I'm stuck in this loop, trying to be what everyone expects me to be, but it's not enough." The vulnerability in his voice, the rawness of his confession, made my chest ache. "It's hard," I said softly, "letting yourself admit that, even to yourself." He looked up at me then, his eyes steady and unguarded. "What about you?" "What about me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are you happy? You happy?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Was I happy? Did I even remember what that felt like? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan pushed off the counter, taking a step closer. "You deserve to be," he said quietly. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tightening as his words sank in. "It's not that simple, Nathan," I said, looking away. "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Because it's not just about me," I said, shaking my head. "There are expectations, responsibilities, people depend on me." "And who do you depend on?" he asked, the question cutting through me like a knife. I stared at him, my breath catching as the truth settled over me. For years, I had carried everything on my own, never allowing myself to lean on anyone. But now, standing here with Nathan, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, threatening to break me. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice softer now. I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. "Nathan, you don't understand." "I do," he said, stepping closer. "I see you every day, holding everything together, pretending you're fine when you're not. You don't have to hide that from me." His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, the tears spilled over. I turned away, covering my face with my hands, but Nathan was there, his hands gentle as they rested on my shoulders. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady and soothing. You don't have to be strong all the time. I shook my head, the tears coming faster now. You don't know what you're saying, I whispered. Yes, I do, he said firmly, turning me to face him. You've spent so long taking care of everyone else, but who's taking care of you? The question shattered the last of my defenses, and I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears. I don't know how to let anyone in, I admitted, my voice trembling. You don't have to know, he said softly, his hand sliding down to hold mine. Just let me try. The warmth of his touch, the quiet conviction in his voice, it was too much. I felt myself leaning into him, my forehead resting against his shoulder as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment we stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, the only sound the faint hum of the kettle and the soft rustle of his breath. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said gently, but you don't have to be. Not with me. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. The storm outside had begun to intensify, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance. I sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the fireplace, though no fire was lit. My hands rested in my lap, clenched together tightly enough to leave marks on my palms. Nathan was sitting across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward. The space between us felt both impossibly small and unbearably wide, every breath filling the room with unspoken tension. We hadn't spoken since the moment in the kitchen, but the weight of it lingered in the air, thick and heavy. You're quiet, he said softly, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, startled by the sound of his voice. So are you. He gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm just trying to figure out what to say. Maybe we don't have to say anything, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Maybe we can just let this go. Nathan's jaw tightened, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady and searching. Can you? He asked quietly. I looked away, my throat tightening. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The rain outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows, and for a moment, the sound filled the room, drowning out the silence between us. You're scared, Nathan said finally, his tone soft but firm. Of course I'm scared, I said, my voice breaking. Nathan, it's not right. It's not supposed to happen. Who says? He asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Everyone, I said, my chest tightening. Society, common sense, decency, it's your pick. Nathan leaned forward again, his eyes locked on mine. But what about what we feel? Doesn't that matter? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth of his question, the raw honesty in his voice left me breathless. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling, this isn't just about us. There are consequences. To what? He interrupted, his voice sharper now. To being happy? To letting yourself feel something real for the first time in years? His words hit like a blow, and I felt the tears rising again, unbidden and unwelcome. You don't understand, I whispered. Then help me understand, he said, his voice softening. I stared at him, my chest tight with emotion. I've spent my whole life doing what I'm supposed to do, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Taking care of people, holding everything together, being the person everyone expects me to be. I don't know how to be anything else. You don't have to be anything else, Nathan said, his voice low and steady. You just have to be you, that's enough. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was almost too much to bear. I felt my breath hitch, my hands trembling in my lap. You're asking me to take a risk, I said softly. I am, he admitted, his gaze unwavering. But I'm asking because I know it's worth it. Because I know you're worth it. The tears spilled over then, hot and unrelenting, and I turned away, covering my face with my hands. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. Nathan didn't move at first, but then I felt the couch shift as he came to sit beside me. His hand rested gently on my shoulder, his touch warm and steady. You don't have to decide right now, he said softly, but I need you to know how I feel. I need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, but I do. His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my ears. Slowly I lowered my hands, turning to look at him. His face was close to mine, his expression open and vulnerable, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling. But before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, as though he were giving me one last chance to pull away. I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. It was like a dam breaking, all the emotions I had been holding back spilling over in a rush of heat and longing. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, my body responding in ways I hadn't felt in years. The room seemed to spin. The storm outside, nothing more than a distant hum, as I lost myself in the warmth of his touch, the strength of his arms around me. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. I could feel the heat of his skin, the steady thrum of his heartbeat against mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," Nathan said, his tone soft but certain. "But it's real." I closed my eyes, my chest tight with a mix of fear and longing. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We figure it out," he said simply. "Together." His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could let myself believe in something more. The morning arrived softly, the storm having passed sometime during the night. The sun filtered through the windows in golden streaks, casting gentle light across the living room. I was still on the couch, wrapped in a throw blanket, staring at the remnants of the night. A wine glass sat forgotten on the table, next to the faint imprint of where Nathan's hand had rested on the fabric of the couch. I hadn't slept much. My mind had been too full, cycling through emotions too vast and too complex to untangle. The memory of his touch lingered, as did the echo of his words. "We'll figure it out, together." The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and I turned toward the doorway. Nathan was there, his hair mussed from sleep, his t-shirt wrinkled. He paused when he saw me, his expression softening. "Morning," he said, his voice low and tentative. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. He hesitated, then stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," I lied, pulling the blanket tighter around myself. Nathan sat down in the armchair across from me, his gaze steady but unreadable. For a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung between us, fragile and unspoken. "I meant what I said last night," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. I looked at him, my heart tightening. "Nathan, I know it's complicated," he said, cutting me off gently. "I know there's a lot to think about, but I don't regret it, not for a second." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet conviction in his eyes, made my chest ache. "It's not just about regret," I said softly. "It's about what this means, about where we go from here." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I know how I feel, and I think you feel it too." I looked away, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the edge of the blanket. "What if this changes everything?" "It already has," he said simply. The truth of his words hit me like a blow, and I felt my breath catch. He wasn't wrong. Everything between us had shifted, the lines we'd both carefully maintained now blurred beyond recognition. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "We'll figure it out together." The quiet certainty in his voice, the way he looked at me like I was something worth holding on to, it was almost too much to bear. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tight with emotion. "Nathan, this isn't just about us. People would never understand." "Maybe not," he said, his tone steady. "But I don't care about them. I care about you." His words hung in the air, and I felt my defenses crumbling. The walls I had spent years building, now nothing more than fragile glass. "You make it sound so simple," I said softly. "Maybe it can be," he replied. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the wind outside. I looked at him, my heart pounding, and for the first time, I allowed myself to really see him. Not as my stepson, not as the boy I had helped raise, but as the man he had become. "I'm scared," I whispered. "I know," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "But you don't have to be. Not with me." The quiet assurance in his voice, the warmth in his gaze, it was enough to make me believe, just for a moment, that maybe this wasn't as impossible as it seemed. "I need time," I said finally, my voice trembling. Nathan nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but steady, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later that morning, after Nathan had gone out for a walk, I found myself sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the garden. The storm had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight catching on the leaves and making them shine like tiny jewels. The house felt quieter now, but not in the way it had before. There was a different kind of silence, one that felt less like loneliness and more like possibility. I thought about the night before, about the way Nathan had held me, the way he had looked at me like I was someone worth fighting for. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, a feeling I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But as I sat there, the warmth of the tea spreading through me, I realized something. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Nathan had seen me. Not the version of myself I presented to the world, but the real me. And even though it scared me, even though I didn't know what the future held, I couldn't ignore the way that made me feel. When Nathan returned, his cheeks flushed from the cool air outside, he smiled at me, and I felt the tightness in my chest ease just a little. Everything okay? He asked, his tone light but curious. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of my lips. Yeah, I said softly. Everything's fine. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Everything wasn't fine. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe it could be. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still so many questions, so many unknowns. But as Nathan sat down beside me, his hand brushing lightly against mine, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, the possibility of something more.